Hello, my name is Richard Brown, and I want to welcome you to this virtual presentation of Deprioritizing the a priori arguments against physicalism. This is a rehearsal of a version of this paper that I'll be presenting on Thursday in 2010, February, whatever it is, 20-something coming up here. Excuse me, March 4th. I know where I am. So March 4th, I'll be presenting this in Ha Quan Lau's graduate seminar on consciousness, and I thought I'd make a virtual presentation out of it. This paper has something I've been working on for something like 2.5 years. Believe it or not, it actually grew out of a blog debate I had at Philosophy Sucks and also at Philosophy Etc. with Richard Chappell. So I wrote up a response, a sort of summary, and why I thought I was right. I presented that at the APA, the Pacific Division in Vancouver, and that was a rewarding experience. I rewrote the paper for a presentation at the first online consciousness conference, called it Turning the Tables on Dualism. Had a lot of very helpful discussion. I'd like to acknowledge Robert Howe and Dave Chalmers especially for helpful comments. And now this is the rewritten version of this paper, which is coming out in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, in a special edition of the journal devoted to the first annual online consciousness conference. So this paper's had a rich history, and this is sort of what I take to be the definitive version of the paper. So I'm excited to go ahead and present it. So let's go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to be doing is defending physicalism. So very roughly speaking, generally, physicalism is the view that only physical things exist. And by physical things, we mean something in particular. We mean those things which are postulated by a completed physics. So currently, these kinds of things involve the things that you'll see on your screen here, sort of a version of the standard model of particle physics, postulating the various particles out there and their properties and the way that they interact. So now this is not to say that this is the completed version, or that any of these things are going to make it into the completed version, but the physicalist is committed to the view that ultimately whatever our completed microphysics tells us reality is composed of, then that's what exists. So now you might say, well, gee, what about the ordinary tables and chairs and furniture of our ordinary day-to-day life? So here's, modernist tables and chairs, but also there's me playing the drums with my consciousness collective in New York at the Parkside Lounge and occasionally other places. So what about those things? Do they exist? Well, of course, the physicalist thinks that those things exist, but they do so because they are composed of the fundamental elements that physics talks about, so and completely and exhaustively composed of them. So at a substructure level, then everything is built out of this stuff and completely exhausted by this stuff. Those are the things which exist according to the physicalist. Now this commits them to a couple of views. So here's Ha Quan Lau, the leader of the seminar, and his lab assistant Sarah in the background singing there, again at Parkside. So consider then, in the philosophy of mind, physicalism commits us to the view that where there's conscious experience, it's just something ultimately reducible to physics explanatorily, and so that we're ultimately be able to deduce just from the physical properties, the qualitative properties. Now, not all physicalists agree that this is the case. So Ned Block famously disagrees. He thinks that you can't do this even though he's a physicalist. But I'm willing to grant that for the purposes of our discussion today, that the physicalist is committed to there being this kind of deduction in principle from the completed physics to qualitative properties and vice versa. Okay, so now also something that physicalism is committed to is a modal thesis, or a thesis about the space of possible worlds. So the physicalist is typically someone, and I especially as an exemplar, am committed to this. So I, as something of an identity theorist, I think that physical properties just are, qualitative properties just are certain physical properties, and that also identities are necessary. So what that means is that wherever you have that physical stuff, you're going to have that mental stuff, since they really are just the same thing. And what that entails is that if there were a duplicate of our world at the microphysical level, then that would be a duplicate period or simpliciter. So here again is a world microphysically identical to our world, and there's Haquan and Sarah again enjoying the nice qualitative experience they do, and this world is microphysically identical to ours. So that's what the physicalist is committed to. Now, of course, there are some well-known problems with physicalism, and these are philosophical problems a priori, which supposedly there are objections to this thesis based merely on certain conceptual analysis of consciousness and intuitions that are generated in the armchair. So here's the first of which. They say, well, look, it certainly seems conceivable that you have a world that's microphysically identical to the actual world, but where there just isn't any conscious experience. So that's what Dave Chalmers has called the zombie world. So the zombie argument then has this following structure. It starts from the premise that zombies are conceivable. You can imagine this zombie world, a world physically just like ours but without consciousness. Well, given that and some other plausible assumptions, which I'm going to grant for the purposes of our discussion, therefore possible, there is a possible world out there where there are zombies, and it follows from that physicalism is false. So now this is a very famous argument, and what I'm going to try to suggest today is that it doesn't pose any real threat to the physicalist. It simply begs the question against the physicalist. Now there's another well-known argument against physicalism. This one originally formulated in its current form by Peter Jackson, although it has anticipations and people going as far back as C.D. Broad and even as far back as people who were objecting to Hobbes in the 1600s. So we don't have to worry about that stuff. But so here's the way it's put currently. So imagine a super scientist named Mary. She's a genius. She's kept in a black and white room for her entire life, raised in this black and white room. She's never allowed to see color, but she's taught all of the physical facts. Now, not just our standard model of physics, but whatever, the ultimate, complete, grand, unified theory of physics is, after we've unified quantum mechanics and relativity physics, and we understand everything there is to know about the physical world. She learns that, but she's never seen colors before. So then one day you bring in a red ripe tomato into her room, and people have this idea, this intuition that she's going to learn something that she might express by saying, oh, so that's what it's like to see red. And of course, that's supposed to be bad because she knew all of the physical facts. So if she knew all of the physical facts, but she didn't know what it was like to see red, it seems to follow that what it's like to see red isn't deducible from the physical facts themselves. And that's, of course, as we were just saying before, something that the physicalist is committed to, and something that I'm going to grant, that the physicalist does have to say that there are these a priori deductions. So here's the way that Chalmers puts the argument, and it's slightly different than the way Jackson originally formulated it. Excuse me. But it puts it in terms of deduction, which I find useful. So let's put it this way. So the first premise says that the connection between the physical and the qualitative is not a priori, right? That's just the intuition you're supposed to have in the Mary case. Mary can't deduce, she can't know what it's like to see red simply on the basis of knowing all the physical facts. So now the second premise says, well, if that's the case, then the connection between them is contingent. Therefore, physicalism is false. Now, again, I'm going to claim that this argument, in a real sense, begs an important question and doesn't pose any kind of problem for the physicalist. So to hone in more on what I'm going to be arguing for today, we need to briefly review this distinction that Chalmers famously makes between kinds of theories. of physicalist theories. So you notice that these two arguments have a common structure. There's some kind of conceivability claim. You imagine something, you have an intuition, and then there's a possibility claim that follows from that, therefore this thing is possible, and then the conclusion. So depending on how you object to the argument, Chalmers classifies you as being a certain kind of physicalist. So people who deny the first premise, namely that zombies are conceivable, are what Dave calls type A duelists. So a type A duelist canonically and typically are people like Churchland and Dennett. And they just say, look, given what we know now, zombies are not conceivable. We can just see they're not conceivable. We can, and that's usually because they end up defining consciousness in terms of some functional activity or something like that. And they're usually limitivists about the notion of phenomenal consciousness, and both of those things are bad. We're going to come back to that later, but let me just note that right now, excuse me, both those things are bad. Okay, so then there's the second group, which is the most popular, and I jokingly say that's everyone else. It's probably not everyone else, but significant number of philosophers take this route. So the type B person agrees that there's that the zombies are conceivable, and that the Mary intuition is strong, that she learns something. But then they go on to deny the connection between conceivability and possibility. So sure, they say it's conceivable, you imagine something, but what does that show us about the way reality could be, about what's possible? So they deny the connection between conceivability and possibility. Now, let me just stipulate that for our purposes here, I am going to allow the connection between conceivability and possibility. So I'm not in the type B camp. I'm not in the type A camp. I'm officially in the what Chalmers would call the type C camp. So the type C people sort of straddle the line of take the best of both worlds. And of course, that's going to be a problem. We'll see later if it can be overcome or not. But anything that tries to get the best of both worlds intuitively seems like it might have problems being a stable position. So we'll come back to that. So the type C physicalist says, look, certainly seems like zombies are conceivable. Certainly seems like Mary would learn something or wouldn't be able to deduce these one thing from the other. So it seems like she would learn something, and so these things are not deducible. But of course, seemings are fallible, as we have too often in the past been reminded of. So while it may seem that way, that doesn't mean that it's actually that way. So we invoke a distinction between what Dave Chalmers calls prima facie conceivability, where prima facie, just Latin for at first blush, or so yeah, sort of intuitively at first sight, these things are appear conceivable, but on ideal reflection, they may not actually really turn out to be conceivable. So that's what I'm going to be arguing for in this paper. My position is a form of type C physicalism. So what kind of type C physicalism? I don't know if it's a kind of physicalism that's been argued for out there in the past. I'm not sure. If it has, I'm sure there's nothing new under the sun, so someone has said something like this before, but I'll try to give a couple of novel arguments for it, perhaps, then at least, or re-incite some interest in this. So I'm an a priori physicalist. So what that means is I'm committed, as I said before, that in principle it can be known a priori that the connections between the physical properties and the qualitative properties. So what does that mean? Well, look, if something is a priori, that means it can in principle be known. What that means is that an ideal agent who knew all the physical facts, who had the completed physical theory, would be in a position to deduce it. But it doesn't follow from this that the way that we're first going to come by this knowledge is going to be by a priori means. So let's take water as an example. And of course, the identity between water and H2O is going to play an important part in the argument here. So now, of course, if you don't know your history, Aristotle thought that water was a simple element which had no simpler parts, that it was a basic constituent of reality which could not be broken down into something similar. So it was something like an atom for him in the Greek conception of atom, an atomos, so something that's not literally can't be cut into smaller parts, which are themselves parts of the thing. Whereas we think that water is, of course, a compound composed of hydrogen and oxygen. And even more surprisingly, those things are composed of parts, electrons, protons, neutrons, and those are composed of parts, quarks, electrons. Maybe those are composed of parts, strings. Who knows? So we're not exactly sure about the basic theory here, but as long as we can assume that we can get from H2O down to the basic physics, we can just stay talking about H2O, and that's fine. So now, this was an empirical discovery on our part that water was composed of H2O. This is something we discovered scientifically or empirically. So now, imagine someone, and this was done in the 1700s, so or late 1600s. Don't quote me on that. But let's just say someone in the early 17th century, so let's say 1605 CE, now they couldn't have known that water was composed of hydrogen and oxygen. The theory of modern chemistry had not been originated yet. They could have known that a certain counterfactual was true, that if the world turns out one way, then it's a compound. If it turns out another way, then it's a simple element. But they couldn't know which of those was true, right? The way we discovered this is empirically. But 235 years later, we can see that in principle, this is knowable a priori. So, and Jackson and Chalmers have argued for this in their 2001 paper, and I'm convinced enough that to allow it to go, that we can, given enough physical information, deduce that H2O is the stuff that does that here. So that we can, in fact, know a priori that water is H2O, even though for us it was an empirical discovery. So that's, in effect, what I want to argue here. So I'm going to argue that we're not yet in a position to see a priori whether physicalism is true or false, and that we're going to come to know this by empirical means. Now, of course, an idealized agent who knew all of the physical facts would be in a position to know a priori that physicalism was true or that it is false. And of course, we're not idealized agents, but the thing I'm griping about here isn't that we can make some claims about what an ideal reasoner can or can't do. So I'm happy to allow that. So most ponens is going to get into the ideal thing, although that's, is a bit contentious, things about law of non-contradiction and so on, but I want to get into arguments about dialetheism here. But here's the point. It's not that the reasoning part. It's the empirical data part. So imagine Aristotle objecting to the identity of water and H2O in the 4th century before the birth of Christ by saying, look, water can't be H2O because I can conceive of a world physically just like ours with H2O and no water. Now, of course, given Aristotle's position, you can see why that seems conceivable to him. But given what we know now, 2,000 years later, given what we know now, we can see that that wasn't really conceivable for a person in that position. It's not really possible to have the world be just like ours and include H2O and yet lack water. Now notice, or something that's watery. Now notice that I'm not saying that it's impossible for there to be H2O that doesn't act watery, but it would have to be under very different physical laws. There'd be some major difference that would cause this stuff to act differently. Given the way the laws work here, given the stuff, if you have H2O, then you have water. So this is sort of exactly what I see people like Dave Chalmers doing. So he says, look, here he is in his zombie t-shirt looking very spiffy saying, look, consciousness can't be physical because I can conceive of a world physically just like ours with no consciousness. The problem is, unless we're in the post-water is H2O scenario, we can't really make that claim for sure. So and the equivalent of that here is unless we can say that we've scientifically falsified various empiricist theories of consciousness, we're not able to say that, right? We may instead be conceiving of a world that's very similar to ours, but which lacks consciousness. Now, before I get misinterpreted, Dave sometimes takes this to mean that I'm talking about type F materialism. I'm not. I'm not talking about conceiving of a world where the fundamental, inscrutable, as Barbara Montero calls them, properties are different. I'm talking about, say, for instance, if the higher order theory of consciousness is right, then the zombie world is just one where there are no higher order thoughts, but there are first order pains. So he might be conceiving of that world because he doesn't see higher order thoughts as being necessary. Now, he may say, sure, I'm including the higher order thoughts in my conception of the zombie world, but we haven't ruled definitively on that yet, and so you can't use the zombie argument as an argument against theories like that. So I'm going to make this argument that only empirical evidence is going to move the debate forward, and that the a priori argument against physicalism isn't any good, by introducing what I call parity arguments or counterconceivability arguments. So two of them are well known from the literature, two of them are not, but they each hopefully illustrate the idea that I want to get across. So first, consider a creature that I've called a zombie. So now, a zombie is sort of the opposite of a zombie. It's the physicalist equivalent of a ghost. So a zombie is a creature that has all of my non-physical properties. So whatever non-physical properties I actually have, my zombie twin has all of those properties. But it doesn't have any qualitative properties, and is not lacking any properties, right? So there's no qualitative properties that are non-physical and missing in the zombie world, because if I have non-physical qualitative properties, then my zombie twin has non-physical qualitative properties. But I can conceive of my zombie twin as not having non-physical properties. So we can sort of formalize this by saying, look, let NP stand for a complete specification of whatever non-physical properties I actually have. And the negation of Q is just that there are no qualitative properties there. Well, NP and not Q is conceivable, it's possible, therefore dualism is false. Now clearly the dualist is going to object to this argument. It's unfair to them, they say. What could be in NP? Since you're a physicalist, you probably think NP is the null set. Well, yeah, I do kind of think NP is the null set. They're right about that, but that's kind of the point. The argument begs the question against the other side, and in exactly the same way as arguments from disembodiment beg the question on the other side as well. So Descartes says, look, I can imagine my mind existing without my body, therefore they're not the same thing. Well, can you really imagine your mind existing without your body? I don't know. I can imagine my quote-unquote mind existing without consciousness. So even if you don't think NP is empty, you might think, well, what's in there? A bunch of thoughts, cognitive stuff like Descartes thought. That's not physical. But there's no consciousness, and you don't need to add anything to make NP the complete set. Now look, the reason why this is conceivable is it's obvious. There's nothing obviously contradictory with thinking that the total set of non-physical properties doesn't include qualitative properties. So there's nothing, unless you're already thinking that the non-physical properties have to include consciousness, because consciousness is a non-physical property, don't you know? Unless you're thinking that, there's nothing contradictory with NP being the complete specification of non-physical properties. Now, of course, that problem right there is exactly the problem that that the zombie argument has. Surely, there's nothing contradictory in sort of prima facie conceiving of the physical stuff being there without the qualitative stuff. So what? Now, these arguments are on a par. So either this argument refutes that argument, or they both make the same mistake. My position is they both make the same mistake. They're clearly begging the question. So consider the second counterconceivability argument in the zombie scenario. So these are creatures that I call shambies. So a shambi is microphysically identical to me. So there's Hawk 1. That's his duplicate. That's not the actual Hawk 1. That's a microphysically identical duplicate of Hakuan in some other possible world. That's his twin. Now, but of course, his Shambi twin. The Shambi twin has the very same physical constitution. It has the very same conscious experience, and it only has physical properties. Now, that's perfectly conceivable. And we can formalize that argument in exactly the same way. That's perfectly conceivable that consciousness be a physical property. There's nothing obviously contradictory in the idea that we discover that the stuff that we're talking about when we pick out the conscious states are just physical states. So we could certainly discover that physicalism is true empirically. It's conceivable. And so Shambis are conceivable. And so again, either the same mistake is being made on the other side, or this argument is just as effective at refuting dualism. Okay, so those are the counter zombie arguments. The next two are the counter knowledge arguments. So we start with someone I'll call Maria, here played by tennis player Maria Sharapova, just because she's a famous Maria. So recall Mary now. Mary was a super scientist, locked in a black and white room, knew all science, never seen color. So Maria is the opposite of that. Maria is the twin sister of Mary, let's say. Now, Maria is taught from a very early age to focus only on her conscious experience. So whereas you and I, when we see a tomato, we think about the tomato and ways that we can interact with it, chop it, slice it, eat it, throw it. Maria doesn't think about the tomato. She thinks only about her experience of the tomato. So she's taught from very, very early to ignore the physical stuff and focus only on her experience of that stuff. We might even think that she's brought up in some kind of sensory deprivation tank. So she might not even really be aware that she has a physical body, only in this loose, vague sense of experience of one. She may be convinced of something like Berkeleyan idealism if she had to put a name on it. So she's someone who's never taught any science, so she's completely ignorant of any scientific theory or fact, and is only taught to deal with, to introspect and to become conscious of her experience. So she knows, she's a master of her own phenomenology. Now imagine that Maria is suddenly one day let out of this sensory deprivation tank. She comes to realize she has a body. She learns all of the science in the quickest way possible, maybe by uploading it directly to her, informationally, directly to her brain mind, because of the completed science of the day would clearly allow them to do that. So she gets the information, perhaps semi-instantaneously, in a few seconds, learning everything from Aristotle's theories to the completed physics of her day. And my feeling is that having just focused on the experience for so long, then learning everything that we know about the brain, and then how the brain could be, ultimately it states, realized in physical things that physics talks about, she's going to have something like, oh, so that's what my experience is, kind of reaction. She, just like she's going to go, oh, so that's what that watery stuff is. It's H2O. She's going to say, oh, so that's what pain is. It's activity in my cingulate cortex. That's what seeing a red tomato flying through the air is. It's activity in V4 and T plus, or something like that. In fact, I think that something like this is kind of the way that most physicalists come to be physicalists. They sort of start off common sense dualists, then they come to realize what else could there be except the brain. They learn how the brain works, and they sort of then go, aha, that's what's got to be going on in there. Now, of course, we can formalize this as follows, right? So in exactly counterweight to the original knowledge argument, the first premise says that the connection is a priori, right? That's what this intuition seems to suggest. We can know this stuff in principle. Of course, she has to have the phenomenal concepts in order to make the deductions. But once she's an expert on those phenomenal concepts, she has the physical stuff, she's able to connect them. So since it's a priori, it's necessary. Now, since it's necessary, dualism is false, or physicalism is true. All right, so fourthly and finally, the last counter-conceivability argument is one from a gentleman named Mark. Mark was named so by Yujin Nagasawa, who put this name to a character that Churchland first introduced back in 1989 in his original response to the knowledge argument of Jackson's. So Mark's in the same position as Mary, kept in a black and white room, never seen color. Just as smart as Mary. He knows the completed, not physical science of his day, but the completed non-physical science of his day. So he knows all of the non-physical facts. Everything that the dualist wants to say about qualitative experience, he knows. But of course, he's never seen red. Then one day, he sees red, and again, the intuition should in this case be just as strong, that when he sees red, he's going to say, oh, so that's what it's like to see red. So he might have known all these non-physical facts about red. Even so, when he sees red, he learns something. So they're on an equivalency here. Now, of course, what I take this to show, as I was just saying in the last slide, is that in order to have make the deductions go through, you have to have actually had the experience. And there's nothing controversial about that. It seems to me that the dualist is committed to the same thing, as I think in this case, Dave could say, well, once he had the concept, he'd seen the actual red tomato, then he could connect that thing with the non-physical facts and make deductions between what it's like and the non-physical stuff. And that's exactly what I say in the physical case. Okay, so given these counterconceivability arguments, then you can see that there are corresponding kinds of dualism here. So there's a type A dualist who's going to deny the counterconceivability claim. So I say Shambies are conceivable. The type A dualist will say, no, they're not conceivable. Chalmers often talks like a type A dualist, especially in the two-dimensional argument against materialism, where he's discussing the conceivability of physicalism. What he says is, well, gee, it may be negatively conceivable, right? There's no obvious contradiction in thinking that physicalism is true, but it's not positively conceivable, because to be positively conceivable, you have to actually be able to give some kind of account, some positive account of how these kinds of deductions could go, how physical properties could be qualitative, how qualitative properties could be physical, and according to him, we don't have anything like that. Now, of course, the type B dualist is going to deny the link between conceivability and possibility. Now, the type C dualist is going to hold that they're both prima facie conceivable, but only one of them is really ideally conceivable. And really, this is sort of the main question here. Look, type A dualism is bad. So is type A physicalism, right? We've got to set aside stipulative answers. So the type A physicalist simply sort of analytically defines away consciousness and just inserts in a bunch of structure and function. Well, the type A dualist does the same thing. He analytically defines away structure and function and inserts in some non-physical, non-structural property. Well, what could that thing be? So we've got to set that aside. We both set aside type B dualism. Well, that's all that's left is type C dualism. But there's no non-question begging reason that can show that zombies are really the ideally conceivable stuff and Shambies and Zombies aren't. What kind of reason could you give for why Shambies aren't conceivable? Well, it's only going to be because you accept some theory, and to you can't conceive it. I accept physicalism, and for me it's very hard to conceive of a zombie because I keep thinking, well, no, if they have the higher order stuff, they're going to be conscious, so you can't say they're not conscious. They have the same consciousness that I do, and I inevitably end up imagining a Shambi world, whereas, of course, Chalmers, on the other hand, I tell him to imagine a Shambi world, and he says, no, that's a zombie world. So the only difference here is which theory we antecedently already accept. Okay, so that's the case there. What the a priori stuff just tells us what theory we accept. What we need is some empirical evidence. What I'm going to do now is go through some objections and replies. Now, I'm not going to go through all the objections and replies that I do in the paper. I go through a great deal of them in there. I'm only going to go over the main objections to type C physicalism and leave the specific ones to the reader. It's in the article. You can pursue it if you're interested. So type C physicalism, says Dave, is an inherently unstable position, and it always either collapses into type A physicalism or type B physicalism, and so doesn't stand as a position on its own. So by way of sort of refuting this, what I'm going to do is, well, look at all of the objections to type A and type B physicalism and show that my view, call it whatever you want, my view doesn't have any of those problems. So let's start with type A physicalism. What's the problem with type A physicalism? Well, the complaint here is the one that I just mentioned earlier. They simply fail to take consciousness seriously. We have to admit there is something to the zombie disembodiment Mary intuitions. They do seem intuitively plausible. Now, of course, I can go on to say they're not ultimately plausible, but it seems to me wildly implausible to say that right now there's no good reason for thinking that this case for the zombies is strong. Of course, the same is true for Shambi, so I think they're on an equivalency here, but still, the case for the zombies is also equally good. We can't explain or eliminate it. So, look, how are we going to make these deductions then? Well, here's how one possible way it could go. So, think about the higher order theory of consciousness. If it's true, this is an important aspect of it. What I have here on the screen is what we call the Transitivity Principle. So a conscious mental state is one which I'm conscious of myself as being in. So here I am, again, enjoying some nice musical phenomenology. Well, if the higher order theory of consciousness is right, then when I have a conscious experience of music, what's going on there is that I have some higher order state, some awareness, either thought like, maybe attention like, maybe perception like, maybe something we don't know what yet, but proprioceptive or something, some kind of awareness of a first order state. So that's a psychological theory of consciousness. Now, when we look in the brain, and here is a picture of people enjoying or processing music, what we see is, well, there are states which seem to represent the auditory notes and the first order states, we could call them. And there seems to be something else over here which is relatively higher up in the prefrontal areas, which, let's suppose, is our awareness of those first order states. Well, given that, we can use our theory of consciousness to identify those physical states. Those are the things which are picked out by our theory of consciousness. Now, it may not turn out to be true, but that's certainly conceivable that this turn out this way. And then, of course, what we could say then is, look, that's what these are, not contingently, but necessarily. So that one way of putting this, which is going to become very important shortly, is that, well, what we have here is a primary intention given by our theories of consciousness and a secondary intention, which happens to be the brain state. Now, Dave can't see this happening because he says, look, there are no conceptual hooks. There's nothing in our concepts of phenomenality which links them up to structure and function. I agree, which is why these things seem intuitively plausible. But what links them are this sort of triangulation in on the physical things which do the stuff that we discover in introspection and the thing that we theorize about. So in broad form, this is a kind of Lewisian move, but it's a Lewisian move combined with the 2D semantics move. So the sort of broadly functional stuff that we get from our theories of consciousness gives us the primary intention of this stuff. The secondary intention is given by the thing that's picked out, but then it's necessary that, secondarily necessary, that this stuff work that way. That doesn't mean that I'm a type A physicalist, though, because I haven't defined consciousness in terms of performing some cognitive function. I've only defined it in terms of my being aware of myself as being in certain states, which is folk pre-theoretically harmless. Now, of course, the reason I can do this is because what else could possibly play this role? What else could we do? But by pick something out by its broadly causal functional profile. What else could be doing that? Some non-physical property? No one's even told us what they are or how they work. So I find that to be wildly implausible. And that's just a sort of counter move to the move that Dave himself makes. He says, look, from structure and function, you just get more structure and function. Qualitative properties aren't structure and function, so you can't have them from a physical theory. Whereas my point here is, look, broadly speaking, everything in the history of the universe has been characterized in terms of its causal connections to other things. So why wouldn't we do that here? And that's exactly what the transitivity principle, the primary intentions of the terms, do. Now, okay, so I've been talking a lot. So I don't think I fall into the problems for type A physicalism. Now, I've been talking a lot about the identity of water and H2O and the a posteriori discovery that water is H2O. So you might think, well, gee, then you're going to run into problems with the kinds of objections that Dave has to the type B physicalists. So let's quickly run through those and show that there is no problem. Okay, so remember that the water has a primary intention, something like the watery stuff. It's the stuff that falls from the skies. It's the stuff that we bathe in, we drink, the stuff we mix our Kool-Aid with, the stuff that we use to make coffee, etc., sustains life, etc., etc. Now, here in the actual world, it turns out that that's H2O. But of course, it's conceivable that water wasn't H2O. So famously, Hilary Putnam introduced this possible world we call twin Earth. On twin Earth, there's stuff that looks just like water, plays all the same causal roles that water does here, except its microstructure is different. It's XYZ. So now there are two ways of thinking about these two scenarios here. So the way that Kripke and traditionally it has been done is you take the actual world as fixed and you think of counterfactually what could be true. So if you take the actual world as fixed, then it can't be true that water is XYZ because it's actually H2O. But there's another way of thinking about these two scenarios here. So think of the twin Earth world and imagine that we discovered that the twin Earth world was the actual world. So instead of it being a counterfactual world, merely possible, think of it as though it were the actual world. Say we found out we lived in it. Well, if we did, then water wouldn't be H2O, it would be XYZ. So if that world were actual, water wouldn't be XYZ. It'd be, water wouldn't be H2O. It'd be false that water was H2O. So Chalmers' point here then is, look, we can grant the Kripkean point about secondary intentions. That's the taking the world as actual move. But the zombie argument, according to Chalmers, works on primary intentions. So all we need to do is the following. If the zombie world had been actual, physicalism would be false. As long as we focus only on primary conceivability, nothing is wrong. We've really got a possible world in mind when we conceive of the zombie world. That's the point that Chalmers is making here. So, look, if you admit that the world is conceivable, then it seems like, well, it's conceivable in exactly the same sense that water isn't H2O is conceivable. It's primarily conceivable. And if the zombie world had been actual, then pain wouldn't be C fiber firing or a singular cortex activity. And so, therefore, that's enough to show that physicalism is false. But, of course, that doesn't affect me because the whole point of the counterconceivability arguments is that it's not clear that zombies really are primarily ideally conceivable. Zombies seem just as conceivable to me. So what evidence is there that they're the inconceivable ones and that zombies are the conceivable ones? The fact that Chalmers pointed them out first instead of me pointing out mine first. So I don't really think that there's any way we can cut here. Now again, the positions are exactly parallel because I can even grant that the zombie world is negatively conceivable, right? So sure, there's no obvious contradiction there in imagining that all the physical stuff be there. I think that if physicalism is true, then there is a contradiction, namely that there's a certain property there and also not there, but it's not obvious. Okay, so the zombie world is prima facie negatively conceivable, but I deny that it's prima facie positively conceivable. In order to do that, you would have to imagine the completed microphysics being instantiated, and yet there being no conscious pains. But how can you do that if you don't know our completed theory of the brain and whether or not certain theories of consciousness ultimately get falsified or not? All right, so finally then, the final objection that I want to talk about to type B physicalism is one from what Chalmers has called strong necessities. So this gets very complicated when it goes into the 2D formulation, but the basic point is very similar. So let me put it in the 2D form, and then let me come back to the basic point. So a crucial premise of the argument here for Chalmers is that the primary and secondary intention of phenomenal concepts are identical. So what that means technically is that a word like pain is going to pick out the same thing no matter whether you consider the world in question as actual or counterfactual. So notice water doesn't do that. Water doesn't pick out the same thing no matter how you consider the world. If you consider twin Earth as counterfactual, water does not pick out X, Y, Z because we're considering it how we would use the term. If you're considering twin Earth as being the actual world, then water does pick out X, Y, Z there. So whether water picks out X, Y, Z on the 2D framework depends on how you consider the world, either actually or counterfactually. Whereas pain is not supposed to work like that. Pain is supposed to pick out the same thing no matter how you consider it. Now, this is just a fancy way of enshrining an intuition. So what's the intuition? The intuition here is that it's impossible for you to think that you're in pain or sincerely, literally to believe that you're in pain and yet fail to be in pain. So for you to be, as Kripke famously put it, in the same epistemic situation as someone who is experiencing pain, you fail to experience pain. And vice versa. If you deny sincerely and literally that you're in pain, then you aren't in pain. So this is supposed to show that there's a huge difference between the way water works and the way pain works, so that when the person like me says that pain is identical to some physical state, they're saying something very different than what we say when water is H2O. Now, why is that? Well, as I just said, the primary intention of a statement like water is H2O comes to be false at some possible world. So take the twin Earth world. On twin Earth, water isn't H2O, it's XYZ. So if you consider that world as actual, as the real world, then it's false that water is H2O. Now, the way we put this in technical 2D terms is that when you have your standard Kripkean a posteriori identities, the primary intention of the identity is contingent, while the secondary intention of the identity is necessary. But if what we're saying here is right about pains, then they don't have a contingent primary intention. So consider I'm in pain here in this picture. I'm really just enjoying playing music, but it looks like I'm in pain. So let's say here I am experiencing pain. So pain picks out the kind of experience that we have, that we're familiar with from our introspective access. And now suppose that here that's activity in the cingulate cortex. at least that's an important part of being aware of pain. So now, if the physicalist is right, then this has some very strange consequences, because if the primary intention and the secondary intention of pain are identical, then what this means is that pain is going to pick out activity in the cingulate cortex at every possible world. So there are no possible worlds where it picks out something else, and that's very different than the way water works. As we just saw, there are possible worlds where water can pick out something else. Now, it's not obvious to me that this is really challenging to the physicalist. Now, it is a challenge to anyone who agrees that the primary and secondary intention of pain are identical. And of course, reflecting on your own experience, you might think that that's an intuitively plausible thing to say. But in sort of illustration of the overall theme of the talk, I think that there is empirical evidence which shows that our a priori reasoning about this is flawed. Or at least what it shows is that there's room, it's not conceptually impossible to make this claim. So let's begin with something that David Rosenthal has talked about in various other places. So here's a quote from his paper, Sensory Quality and the Relocation Story, and this appears in his book, Consciousness in Mind. This is page 172. So let me just read this. He says, dental patients occasionally report pain when physiological factors make it clear that no pain could occur. The usual explanation is that fear and the non-painful sensation of vibration cause the patient to confabulate pain. When the patient learns this explanation, what it's like for the patient no longer involves anything painful, but the patient's memory of what it was like before learning the explanation remains unchanged. Even when what it's like results from confabulation, it may be no less vivid and convincing than a non-confabulatory case. End quote. Now, I've always liked this dental fear stuff. It's a good way of getting into the idea that what it's like to be in pain and pain itself are different. So there's no pain in this case because the dental patient has their nerves anesthetized. So if pain is a first order state, there is no first order state there. What's going on here is that the patient is aware of themselves or aware of some other first order state as being painful. So I've always thought that was a really nice example. Now, sadly, notice Rosenthal doesn't offer any citations for this, and I did a little bit of research trying to find more information on this, but it's very hard to find people talking about this. I did, however, manage to find one thing. So this is a selection from the British Journal of Dentistry, and it's published in 1999. And this is sort of a practical paper on how you deal with dental fear. So here's what they say. Problems that a dentist is convinced are associated with misrepresentation of pain may be addressed by explaining the gate theory of pain. A very basic explanation, which is suitable for children as young as 5, is as follows. You have lots of different types of telephone wires called nerves going from your mouth to your brain. Some of them carry ouch messages, and the others carry messages about touch and hot and cold. The sleeping potion stops the ouch messages being sent, but not the touch and the hot and cold messages. So you will still know that I am touching the tooth, and you will still feel the cold of the water. Your brain looks out for messages all the time. If you are convinced that it will hurt, it will. This is because if I make the ouch messages nerves go off to sleep and I touch you, a touch message gets sent. But your brain is looking for ouch messages, and it says to itself, there's a message coming, it must be an ouch message. So you go ouch and it hurts, but all I did was touch you. It's just that your brain was confused. End quote. So here I think clearly what we have is a case of what we might call fool's pain. Or in other words, something which presents itself subjectively as though it were pain, but isn't. The subject is confused. And the evidence that this is fool's pain and not real pain, not that the person really isn't in pain, is evidenced by the fact that the doctors treat it not with anesthetic, but with an explanation pitched at the kid's level for why they can't be in pain. And typically that results in the kids no longer feeling the experience as painful. They still remember it as painful, the earlier experience, but they no longer experience it as painful. Now, of course, it says this doesn't happen all the time, so sometimes they have to stop because this explanation doesn't work. In those cases, we can just rule out. But in the cases where the explanation works, what seems like is going on there is the person is confused about what state they're in. They think they're in pain and they're wrong. They're not in pain. Now, of course, that's very nice because what that shows is that we can give it's exactly the kind of thing that we would expect if the Lewisian kind of view I suggested earlier was right. So we need a view that says that the primary intention of pain is contingent. And it looks as though this is a plausible view because that's what we're discovering, is that you can pick states out as painful that aren't painful, or aren't pains, excuse me. And that gives us a plausible reading in the 2D semantics. There could be other things which were picked out as painful, but which weren't the things that we pick out as being painful. So maybe even possible worlds where robots feel pains. So in this world, the pain, the thing that's picked out by the painful stuff is not brain activity. That's no threat to the identity theory. And so I think the flaw with all multiple realizability arguments, there's no problem there if you're thinking about this in the 2D way. It's exactly what you would expect, as a matter of fact, on a higher order theory. Okay, so now finally, I just want to make this last point about a priori reasoning. So we've discovered something called pain asymbolia, and here's a picture of some pain routes in the brain. And so in the middle there's the insula, and that's very important for pain processing, connected to the anterior cingulate cortex. And you can see it loops back around to the amygdala, and there's the periaqueductal gray. So there's all kinds of things in there that are important, and the prefrontal areas. Okay, so pain asymbolics have damage to the insular cortex. Large parts of the insula are wiped out in pain asymbolics. And what we discover is that these people are able to discriminate painful stimuli, saying, for instance, something hurts. They can say how much it hurts, if it burns, if it pinches, if it stabs. They can say how intense it is, so they can tell the difference between a light pinprick and a skin-piercing stab wound with a pin. So they're clearly having the pain sensation, but they're not motivated to pull away. They don't find it unpleasant. They don't want it to stop. They often laugh or smile as they're being burned and poked and cut in the laboratory. Now, of course, pain asymbolia is highly contentious, but there's at least one way of thinking about it, which might not even be the actual way, and that doesn't matter. Well, all we need is that it's conceivable. So it certainly shows us that something is conceivable here. And here's what's conceivable. The property of being painful is a contingent feature of pain. Well, if so, then when Chalmers thinks he's imagining the zombie world, he isn't. He's really conceiving of a world which is very much like ours. It's got cingulate cortex activity, but that activity doesn't have the contingent property of being painful for the zombie. There's no conscious experience of the pain. Now, of course, the higher order theorist goes on to say, well, what's the contingent property of being painful? How does that come about? Well, that's when you're aware of the pain. So that must be lacking in the world that Chalmers is conceiving of. Now, Chalmers thinks that that's there, but again, it's not obvious that it is if we haven't ruled out the higher order theory already. So, this again is the sort of standard move. You think you're imagining something, but you aren't. You have access to a real world. It's just not the world that you think that you do. Okay, so, and then finally, in summing this stuff up, there's something that Kripke says in another context, which I find very helpful here. So, Kripke's talking about a possible world where there are creatures who see visually the way we do, but not by using light. So they have the same visual experiences, but they're sensitive not to photons, but to what we would call heat or mean molecular kinetic energy. So he says, look, is that a world where light is really heat? He says, no. That's a world intuitively where there are creatures that pick out heat in the very way that we pick out light. Now, that seems weird to us to say because the fact that we identify, and this is the quote on the screen, the fact that we identify light in a certain way seems to be crucial, right? We pick out photons by the way they appear to us. That seems to be crucial, even though it turns out that's not necessary. We could have picked out heat, for instance. The intimate connection may create the illusion of necessity. Now, I think that's exactly what's going on here in the case of pain. So there's an intimate connection clearly between unpleasantness, the painfulness, and the pain sensation. And that intimate connection fosters on us the illusion of a necessary connection between them. So we think that wherever there's pain, it has to be painful. But the empirical results suggest that that's not the case. So there are no strong necessities here, in short. Pain works exactly like water. There's no problem with primary possibility. There's no reformulated objection because I deny that the zombie world is really ideally conceivable. There's no problem from type A materialism because I endorse I'm a qualia realist. I think that there are qualia. I don't simply define consciousness away or eliminate it. So I don't think that my view falls prey to any of the objections. Call it what you will. It's not subject to those objections. So then the overall conclusions. Here's the main point. Once the parity objections are on the table, there's nothing short of jumping up and down, pounding on the table, that's going to decide which set is really the ideally conceivable one at this point. Chalmers says it's zombies. I say it's shombies. He says it's ghosts. I say it's zombies. How are we going to decide that? Well, in order to answer that question, we've got to empirically determine whether or not various theories of consciousness are true, and so whether or not we can make these kinds of deductions. That's something that we're going to learn empirically. Now, of course, once we're empirically able to do that, a priori methods will be wonderful, and we'll be able to see which ones of these are really ideally conceivable. But of course, by then, we won't need them since we'll know the answer already. Thank you very much.